Okay, folks, Panzer J back, and we're doing game number 3 of Axis and Allies Global 1940. So if you've seen the first couple of videos I've done, the first 2 games that were played, both ended in Axis victories, and pretty convincingly at that. So I'm going to try to, of course, playing fairly, see if we can get an Allied victory here. So some of the comments you guys have left have been helpful as far as pointing out a couple of things that I did incorrectly, especially in game number 1. It had been a while since I had played this, and I kind of confused a few of the rules in this game with Historical Board Gaming's Global War series. So thanks for pointing those out to me. So I think I corrected those in game number 2, but again, it still turned out to be an Axis victory. So we'll see what we can do here for the Allies. Some of the comments that were made as far as pursuing different Allied strategies was several comments about how the British and even the Russians need to strategically bomb some of the German factories so that Germany can't place as many units on the board in the major factories, or at the very least they have to pay money to repair them, which obviously in turn would eat into the money they have to place new units down. So we're going to see if we can give that a go and see if that makes a difference. We have completed turn 1 here. So if we take a look, a lot of the typical things have happened in turn 1. Germany has taken all of France, so all the French territory in Europe itself is completely under German control. Although the Germans did lose quite a few units, including a couple of tanks in southern France, so that's obviously going to affect them as far as what they're going to be able to move back onto the Eastern Front. Germany activated Bulgaria, activated Finland. They took Yugoslavia, and they moved a bunch of units up onto the border with the Soviet Union. They didn't try for Greece. They left that for Italy, and we'll get to that Italian fiasco here in a minute. But Germany's sitting at $44 minus bonuses. Also, for an naval engagements, they took out the British fleet up here in Sea Zone 111. They took out the destroyer and transport in 106, and they came down and took out the cruiser here in 91, and that was to help out Italy. And the Germans still have the 3 subs in the Atlantic, so not too bad as far as Germany goes. Their entire air force is concentrated in Western Germany, so possibly an attack on the remaining British ships in the Atlantic. As far as the Russians, they were next up in turn sequence. Not a whole lot for them to do. They built some tanks, put them down in Moscow. They backed everything off the border with Germany except for left 1 man in each territory. So Germans can't just walk right in, and they're not going to be able to inflict too much in the way of casualties. And they brought a bunch of units into Leningrad. All in the Far East, they went ahead, and they didn't want to concentrate all of their units into one territory. In each of the last 2 games, Japan has ended up attacking the Russians, so they didn't want to leave everything in one territory for a big invite for Japan to just come in. So they did move a little bit further, trying to reach the Soviet Far East maybe, so that Japan doesn't have any territory they can just land in unopposed. As far as the Japanese go, they did not do a J1 attack. I believe this is the second, maybe even the 3rd game now where they have not done that. So Japan bought a minor complex. They put on the Chinese mainland and bought a couple of transports. They moved also a couple of transports up into Japan, so now they have the 4 total transports to move this big stack of men and some artillery and a tank around. They mostly just concentrated on taking out China, and they've accomplished that, major step towards accomplishing that. They took a few territories, some of which were empty. But the main thing is they've got a huge air force down here in Guangxi. They still have quite a bit of ground units. Didn't take too much in the way of casualties, and they've already got China backed up. A couple territories with a single man each, and that was about it. They also went ahead and positioned 2 fleets. So they've got one here, both of them in the South Pacific, one over here by the Chinese coast, and that's a fleet of a destroyer, a sub, a cruiser, a battleship, and a carrier with a tactical and a fighter. And that's in position to deal with the Far East Command when Japan goes to war with them. The other fleet, they concentrate in the Caroline Islands. That's 2 loaded carriers, 2 tacticals, 2 fighters, a sub, 3 destroyers, a cruiser, and a transport. And they've got a couple of men on the islands too, so they could go maybe over towards Hawaii, or even venture a little bit further beyond Hawaii. They could also come down here, go south, and come into Australia as well. So there's a few different places Japan can go, having those 2 fleets positioned down in the South Pacific. And Japan is up to $30 minus bonuses. And since they didn't go to war with any of the Western powers, they get the $10 bonus for trade with the U.S. So not too bad for Japan. As far as the U.S., again, if you remember, this was a mistake I made in game number 1. These U.S. factories are only minor factories until the U.S. is actually at war. So they only can produce 3 units a turn. So the U.S. bought a carrier, a battleship, and a tactical bomber. They already had a fighter in Western United States. So once I put all those down here, the fighter went to that carrier. So the U.S. has quite the fleet off of San Francisco. 2 loaded carriers, a couple battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 transports, a sub, and a couple destroyers. So they already have quite a bit of a counterattack force to what Japan has in the Pacific. They also moved a bunch of units, ground units that came over from the eastern United States, and now they've got a bunch of units for those 3 transports to move around. As far as the Far East Command, not a lot. They came down, took Sumatra, so that got them $4. They bought a fighter and a tank. They put down in India. They put this destroyer up as a blocker, moved their battleship back, and not a whole heck of a lot for them to do. Same thing with Anzac. They came over here with a man and took Java, so that got them $4. They actually saved their money this turn, and that was really about it. Just positioned a couple of units in Australia itself. But with what they saved and with taking Java, they're up to $24 they can spend the next turn. As far as China goes, again, the Japanese pushed them back several territories. The Chinese did counterattack into Yunnan, and that went horribly wrong for the Chinese. Japan had just 2 infantry and artillery, and China had come over with 4 infantry and the fighter, and they lost all the infantry. They did take out the Japanese units, but with no ground unit to take Yunnan, they weren't going to sacrifice the fighter for that, so they just pulled back. So Yunnan stayed Japanese, and that also eliminated the bonus the Chinese get for having the Burma Road open, because it's still closed because of the Japanese possession of Yunnan. So not that great for China. On the European side, besides, we already covered the Germans and the Russians. The U.S. didn't do a lot. Pretty much their entire build was spent in the Western United States, along with moving units over. So not a lot the U.S. did over here. The British, they went ahead and took out the Italian destroyer and transport that were here. They also moved some units down into Anglo-Egyptian Sudan to take care of these Italian units here in Central Africa. They also moved a couple of guys up from the Union of South Africa. So they're in a position, they kind of got these Italian units in a crunch there. They had built a minor complex they put in Egypt, and a couple of destroyers they put outside of London. That was about all they did in the Med. They still have a decent navy. That's a loaded carrier, a cruiser, a destroyer, and a transport by Malta. And they also have a destroyer outside of Egypt, and a French destroyer also came up. So Italy wasn't able to get the bonus of no Allied ships in the Mediterranean. So that was good news for the Allies. Up here off of the coast of Scotland, there was a damaged German battleship left. They took that out. Didn't really do a whole heck of a lot else. They're trying to build up a little bit of a navy. They got 3 destroyers, battleship, and a French destroyer. So a pretty decent presence right there. As far as Italy goes, not a lot. They went into Greece and they ended up losing badly. They lost 2 men, a strategic bomber, and a tank, and didn't take Greece. There's still 1 Greek infantry left. So that was horrible for Italy. They did end up taking Algeria and Tunisia. So they got a couple bucks there. And they also spread out down here in Central Africa to take away a bonus for England so that they don't have all their original territories. That was about it for Italy. And that's where things stand after turn 1. We'll see how things turn out after turn 2. Turn 2 now complete, and Global War 1940. So let's start over here on the European side of the map. So Germany continues to move units over towards the east in anticipation of the coming conflict with the Russians. So for purchases, they bought 10 tanks, put them down in Romania in that major factory, and then they had a man and a fighter. The man went in Paris, and the fighter went in Western Germany. So not a lot of attacks this turn for Germany. They're kind of just setting things up for, again, the coming conflict with Russia. They did go into Greece. Italy did most of the heavy lifting. Unfortunately, the Italians got wiped out on turn 1. They left the Greeks with 1 infantry. The Germans came in and took that with no losses. And then the British were trying to build up a fleet here in Sea Zone 110. There was a French cruiser, a British transport, a British battleship, and 3 British destroyers. And the Germans launched their entire air force. Their entire air force at the end of turn 1 was in Western Germany. So that was 2 strategic bombers, 5 fighters, and 5 tactical bombers attacked that fleet. The British did go ahead and scramble the 3 fighters they had in London, and that was probably a mistake because the Germans definitely got the best of that action. They went ahead and, at the loss of 4 fighters, took out everything. The 3 British fighters, the 3 destroyers, the cruiser, the battleship, and the transport. So Britain's pretty much left. There's no navy at all. They've got a single cruiser up here that's trying to escape, but the German Air Force can reach it, so that's probably not going to live past this turn 3 coming up. Now, London itself doesn't have a lot of defenses there. 4 total infantry and a French fighter, but the Germans have just 1 transport, and that's not in position to get to London. So the British aren't in any danger of losing London, but they now basically have no navy at all in the Atlantic. The Germans still have these 3 subs over here that moved up, and even their cruiser moved over, so the cruiser will probably make its way over into the Atlantic on this turn as well. That was about it for Germany. The Russians, they bought more tanks and a couple men. The couple of men went into Leningrad, the tanks in Moscow. So they've got a decent force there, about 10 tanks roughly. And just basically besides that, just continued to have a single man in each territory bordering with Germany. As far as the British go, they did come out on the short end of the stick again in the sea and air battle in 110. But if we look at the Mediterranean, they've got Italy pretty much boxed up. The British went ahead and attacked the Italian fleet here in this sea zone off of Tunisia, and they took out 2 transports, 2 cruisers, and a battleship. And as far as the spending their money this turn, they spent it all in this minor factory in Egypt. They bought a carrier, a fighter, and a sub. So as you can see, the British are basically in complete control of the Mediterranean. The Italians are down to a single ship, a destroyer off of Rome, and that's it. So Britain completely owns the Med. They also came down in Central Africa and wiped out this Italian force here. So the British are in good shape, not only by controlling the Med, but also in a good position to take control of Africa away from Italy. The U.S. didn't spend any of their money on the European side. And then as far as Italy goes, again, another rough turn for them. 2 turns in, and they're already really boxed in and have limited options. They did come over and take Morocco. They had this single artillery attack, the single French infantry, and Italy won that. They kind of just are putting everything they can into Tobruk, beefing up the defenses there. They spent all their money except for $1 and bought 2 tactical bombers. No sense in buying naval units for Italy because, again, the British completely control the Med. The British would have just taken them right out. So Italy basically can't get any units into Africa. Their transports won't survive. So the only thing they could do is buy air units. So 2 tacticals can come over and maybe help out with some attacks in Africa possibly. But again, Italy's down to just $12, no bonuses. So Italy's in rough shape, just 2 turns into the game. Over in the Pacific, again, Japan stayed away from attacking the Western Allies. So the United States is still not in the conflict. For purchases, Japan bought 3 tanks, which they put into this minor factory in Shanghai. And then they bought a carrier, and then they had a tactical and a fighter land on that. So they got their 4th loaded carrier on the board. In China, they continue to inch their way forward, and the Chinese kind of are in the same position as the Italians on the European side of the map. They're pretty much boxed in. Japan took a few more territories in northern China, moved everything up, so now they're right at the border of Sichuan, and that's all China has as far as units in a territory is in Sichuan. They got about 10 men and a fighter, but Japan is adjacent to Sichuan with about 6 infantry, 2 artillery, and a huge air force, like 3 tacticals and like 5 fighters. So Sichuan will probably fall this turn, and that'll pretty much be the end of China. Japan will also be able to take a couple of these vacant territories in northern China. So the Japanese strategy of trying to take out China first and wipe them out is definitely successful, is succeeding right now. They did attack the Soviet Union, so they went into the Far East, and that didn't go so good. They took it. There were 6 defending Russian infantry, but the Japanese lost all 5 of their infantry and only have a single tank that survived. So I'm sure the Russians will come over with this infantry force to take out that tank on Russia's turn 3 here. Besides that, Japan continued to maneuver some fleets around. This fleet that was off of Hanang came down, and now it's in Java. So that's strategically positioned. They could come down and attack units in Australia. They can go ahead and go and start taking out the Far East Command. They also continue to beef up the force that they have in the Caroline Islands. They brought down they brought down an artillery and a man from Japan on a transport, and they also flew 2 strategic bombers out there. So now in the Caroline Islands, they've got a nice naval task force, a couple loaded carriers, 3 destroyers, a cruiser, a sub, and 2 transports. And then they also have 2 strategic bombers, 2 men, and 2 artillery. So they have both a naval and an air base there. So the naval units move 3 spaces, and that's an additional space for the air units. So those 2 strategic bombers can move now 7 spaces. So as you can see, 1, 2, 3, they can easily reach Australia on this next turn, both the fleet in the Carolines and the fleet in Java. So Japan definitely is in position to take on Australia right on turn 3, which, since the U.S. comes into the game regardless at the end of turn 3, Japan will definitely be attacking the Western Allies this turn. You can expect these tanks in Shanghai to come down 2 spaces to Kwangtung. They'll move into French Indochina, maybe start taking the Money Islands back. and again, possibly attack Australia. As far as the U.S., they spent all their money in San Francisco, the western United States. So as you can see, the U.S. has a huge naval force off of San Francisco. That's 3 loaded carriers, 3 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 transports, 2 destroyers, and a sub. So honestly, if you added up naval units, the U.S. actually might have the advantage over the Japanese in the Pacific. But obviously it would take a couple of turns for this U.S. force to get anywhere to engage the Japanese. As far as Australia, seeing what's going on with Japan coming down possibly for the Caroline Islands, they went ahead and just bought all infantry. So they kind of turtled up into Sydney. So they've got 4 men, an artillery, and 3 fighters there. So probably not enough. If Japan really wants to take out Australia, they probably can in the next turn or two. As far as the Far East Command, they came out, took Celebes. So that was an extra $3 for them. And then they bought a fighter and 4 infantry for India. So the Japanese aren't anywhere near taking India, though. So the Far East Command will have at least a few turns to cause some headaches for the Japanese heading into turn 3. So I forgot something real quick from turn number 2. So in the first solo game I had of this, a lot of comments were encouraging the Allies to engage in bombing of the German factories as a way to obviously degrade Germany's ability to put units on the board, or at least forcing them to spend money. So we decided to give it a try, and it completely backfired on the British. So they had a strategic bomber here in London, came into Paris. The Germans didn't have any fighters there, so there was no scramble defense there. But the industrial complex does have an integrated AA, and on a roll of 1, on a 6-sided die, it shoots down the strategic bomber, and the Germans rolled a 1. So the strategic bomber got shot down without doing any damage. So not a good way to start a strategic bombing campaign for the Allies. See if they can do any better in subsequent turns. So turn 3 is complete. We got a few interesting developments. We'll start on the Pacific side, since that's where most of the action took place. So because of the fact that the U.S. is going to come into the conflict at the end of the turn 3 regardless, Japan went ahead and launched a bunch of simultaneous attacks on the Western Allies here on turn 3. Japan had probably about a half a dozen or so different attacks. So they took the Philippines. They had a naval engagement down here south of Australia. They had come into Shan State. They took Kwangtung. They went into Amur, which triggered the Mongolian rule. So then the Russians take possession of Mongolia and get to put men on the board. But Japan already went into one of the Mongolian territories to kind of soften that up and lessen the units that the Russians are going to be able to have at the end of the turn. And Japan continued the conquest of China. They took Sichuan. So a good turn for Japan overall. They're up to $47 at the end of this turn without bonuses. For a build, they went ahead and put down another carrier and some destroyers, 3 destroyers and a sub. So how things look for Japan at this point, they are in a position now where they also landed in Celebes as well. So they're in a position now with a couple of transports and some ground units to start taking all of the money islands. They have wiped out the Australian ships, and the Far East Command ships have pulled back into the Mediterranean. So the only Allied ships in the Pacific right now are the U.S., and we'll get to that massive U.S. fleet here in a minute. So Japan will probably all but definitely finish off China this turn. China's down to just 2 territories with 1 man each. So China's about to fall. Japan also probably won't be able to finish off the Russians in the Far East this turn. They'll probably be able to take Siberia and maybe start taking up some of these vacant Russian territories, but I don't think they can reach the Far East, the Soviet Far East territory this turn, at least not with enough force to take it. But Russia will probably be just about on its last legs in the Pacific side of the map as well. The Far East Command for defenses, they built all men. So they do have a stack of about 18 men, 3 fighters in India. So it's going to be a little bit before Japan can tackle that. I wouldn't be surprised to see Japan maybe put down a minor complex in French Indochina this turn and start turning their attention more towards the Far East Command and dealing with them. The Australians, since the Japanese had pulled back and went after some of the Money Island and the Philippines, there's not as much of a danger right now of Sydney being invaded. So Australia, which is actually collecting a decent amount of money because they have $10 just worth of bonuses, actually built a couple of fighters this turn. So they've got a stack of 5 fighters in Sydney. So those can kind of fly out and maybe pick off some Japanese ships that might be lurking around the coast of Australia. And then for the United States, they're now fully in the conflict. And they again spent all their money on the Pacific side. So they built yet another carrier, a destroyer, a transport, a tactical, and a cruiser. And then they brought this massive Navy, all came down here to Hawaiian Islands. So the U.S. has 3 battleships, 3 cruisers, 3 transports, 2 destroyers, a sub, 3 carriers with 3 tacticals and 3 fighters each, a strategic bomber, and then they've got infantry, a tank, a mech, and an artillery for ground units. So the U.S., that fleet right there that the U.S. has is more than a match for any of the dispersed fleets that the Japanese have in the Pacific. So Japan's going to definitely have to probably combine this fleet down here in the Philippines along with up in Japan. And they also probably have to buy a bunch of naval units this turn because the U.S., unless the Japanese throw up blockers, this force in Hawaii can reach Tokyo here on the next turn. It can move 3 spaces because of the naval base. So Japan probably will throw up blockers and give them an extra turn to buy some more units. So it's going to come down to a big showdown in the Pacific between that massive U.S. fleet and the Japanese. We'll see if the U.S. can put enough pressure on Japan that they have to start concentrating on the defense of Japan itself and maybe give the Far East Command enough breathing space to survive and go on the offensive themselves here in Southeast Asia. So that's how things look on the Pacific side. Over in Europe, Germany still isn't at war with Russia. But now here on turn 4, even without a German attack, Russia would be in the conflict. So Germany is going to go ahead and attack here on turn 4. They spent all their money, again, in this major factory in Romania. So that's a stack of about 18 to 20 tanks in Romania, 5 mechs, a couple artillery, and about 5 men. And then on the border with central Russia here, you've got 2 different stacks of about 15 men, 5 tanks, a couple of artillery, 5 Stukas. And on the border with northern Russia, you've got an artillery and a stack of about 15 men. So Germany has quite a few units posed on the border here. They'll be going into Russia again this turn. They'll be able to break. Obviously, these initial Russian territories all have just a single man each. Russia basically has concentrated 2 main forces, one in Moscow and one in Leningrad. So in Moscow, you've got about 18 tanks, an artillery, a couple of mechs, and a man. So the tanks will be able to come out maybe and attack maybe some vulnerable German units as they move closer into Moscow. And up north, that's a stack of about 20 men. They also have their entire air force, a couple of fighters, and a tactical in Leningrad. So the Russians will be able to actually push probably into Finland, quite possibly, because they have more units up there than the Germans currently do. So war is about to break out on the Eastern Front. Besides that, the Germans finished off the British cruiser that was up in 126. So now the only allied or soon to be allied units, naval units in the Atlantic are just Russian. There's no U.S. or British naval units in the Mediterranean at all. So these German U-boats just sitting off the coast of England there, waiting to see if the British put down any new naval units. The British really don't have a lot going on in London. They spent all their money in Egypt again this turn. So the Germans have no danger of an invasion in Western Europe at all. The Germans did leave some planes in Western Germany, but not a whole lot of action going on there. And the U.S., again, spent all their money in the Pacific, so they're not in a position to threaten Germany either. So Germany's going to be able to concentrate, at least for a couple of turns, probably on just dealing with Russia. So see how that plays out. But the British do have a stranglehold in the Med still. That's a nice fleet they got outside of Egypt, 2 carriers, a battleship, 3 cruisers, and they also put down another transport. So now they have 2 transports there. So the Italians and even the Germans, by extension, are going to have to worry about possibly the soft underbelly of Europe here, and the British landing somewhere in southern Europe, possibly even going for Rome. Maybe not for another turn or two. They're going to have to build up some more transports to be able to bring more ground units. But Italy is just basically holed up in Rome. They did come out and take Alexandria just to give them a buffer before the British can get to Tobruk. They do have a decent force in Tobruk, about 5 men, a couple artillery, a tank, and a mech. But it can't stand up to what the British have, and the British have so much more money right now. Italy's down to collecting like $12 with no bonuses. So Italy's pretty much just strictly on the defensive. It probably won't be too much longer before they're kicked out of Africa altogether. And again, the British building up a decent force to start threatening Rome. So that's how things look after turn 3. Again, war is about to break out on the Eastern Front, and we'll see how that changes the complexion of the game after turn 4. So turn 4 is done here in Global War 1940, and some interesting developments. The Allies have started to apply some pressure to the Axis in a few parts of the globe here. So we'll start off here on the European side of the map. So the Germans on turn 4 had declared war on Russia, and they went in. And they've just got a couple of the border territories here. Nothing too spectacular. The Baltic states, Bessarabia, East Poland. The Germans didn't actually move into Russia in the north. They could have went into Karelia or Vyborg, but the Russians have such a huge force in Leningrad. They would have just counterattacked and probably destroyed this German force in Finland. So Germany instead is going to wait in the north a little bit until their units on the central and southern portion of the front probe deeper into Russia, apply some pressure there, and then hopefully the Russians would have to draw some units from Leningrad to counterattack that, and then the Germans will move in the north. They built 10 tanks again and put them in Romania. So if you look here on the border with Russia, there's 2 big stacks of tanks. This stack right here in Bessarabia is about 20 tanks, 10 more coming. They've got another 5 in East Poland. So the Germans have quite the offensive punch going into Russia. Besides that, the Germans didn't do a whole heck of a lot. They got 3 subs and a cruiser off of the coast of Scotland. Didn't put any money in Western Europe at all because there was absolutely no danger of the British or the Americans landing in Western Europe. So it all went to the Eastern Front. The Russians went ahead and reacted by building 10 mechs that they put in Moscow. So the Russian thinking is, as the Germans move a little bit deeper into Russia, the Russians now have about 15 mechs and about 20 tanks in Moscow. So they can definitely do some damage if the Germans were to get close enough and leave a territory with not a whole lot of units in it. The Russians can definitely pick off those German units. So Germany's going to have to be careful as they get closer to Moscow to not leave a territory with so few units that it's an inviting target for the Russians to come after them. So that was it on the Eastern Front. As far as the only other action was in Africa, the U.S. spent all their money in the Pacific again. The British went ahead and built artillery, a man, and a transport off of Egypt here. So now the British, as they continue to have control of the Med, they now have 3 transports. So they're going to be able to move 3 men and 3 artillery here on turn 5. Probably not enough to take out Rome yet, but they could land maybe in Greece, maybe land in southern France. At least they now have the ability to move around quite a bit. They had taken Alexandria back. Wasn't worth anything, but they wanted to get that original territory back so they could claim their $5 bonus. They also built 2 fighters they placed in London, although the Germans have no transports or units that they can get into London anytime soon. So not really a danger to London itself, but just trying to build up an air force to maybe start doing some bombing and some attacks, some aerial warfare in Western Europe. The Italians only had $12 to spend, so they built a tactical they put in Rome. So they have a decent air force in Rome. They got 3 fighters and 3 tacticals. They also have a stack of about 7 men and a tank. So I think Rome is pretty secure for the time being. But Italy's running out of units outside of what they have in Rome. So Italy's kind of just turtled up into Rome itself, not really presenting any kind of danger to the Allies. They did come back and they took Alexandria back. It's not worth anything, but just more of a buffer to have in between the British and Tobruk than for any other reason. And that was pretty much it on the European side. On the Pacific side is especially where the Allies are starting to apply some pressure. So Japan, on their turn, had went ahead. They built a battleship and 3 destroyers. And then they went ahead and they sent out some destroyers as blockers because the U.S. had this huge fleet in the Hawaiian Islands. So they sent out the destroyers as blockers so that the U.S. could not reach Japanese home water on this turn. Besides that, they went ahead and continued to take out Russian units here in the Far East. They took 3 more Russian territories. So if you look here, the only thing the Russians have in the Far East at all is in Soviet Far East, and that's 4 infantry. So Japan's almost completed the conquest of Russia here on the Pacific side of the map. They also moved a territory deeper into Mongolia. They went ahead and they took out the Chinese. So the last 2 Chinese territories fell. So now no territory or Chinese units on the board at all. They went ahead, they placed a minor factory down in French Indochina. They came over here with this small fleet. They took Borneo and they took Java. And they've got a small fleet carrier with a tactical and a fighter, a battleship, a couple of cruisers, and a destroyer. And that was pretty much it for the Japanese. I think they collected $60 this past turn. So they're got quite the income going. But they definitely have some issues to worry about heading into turn 5. So the U.S., they went ahead and they came out to these waters off of Midway and Wake and took out the Japanese destroyers that were being used as blockers. And they've got this huge fleet over here, just 2 sea zones away from Japan itself. So that's 4 carriers, all with a tactical and a fighter each, 3 battleships, a cruiser, and they have 2 transports with a tank and 4 infantry. So the U.S. could possibly try for Tokyo this next turn. although the Japanese will probably throw up some more destroyers as blockers, so they could prevent this fleet from reaching Japan again on turn 5. They could come up here and land in the Soviet Far East to reinforce the Russians with the little bit of ground units they've got. So they have a few different options. The U.S. spent all their money in the Pacific. They built 9 destroyers, and they're off of the west coast of the United States. They also then came down with this small fleet, took the Caroline Islands. That's a couple of transports with 3 infantry and an artillery, a destroyer, and 3 cruisers. So again, the Caroline Islands not worth any money, but took a territory off of Japan, and it has a airfield and a naval base there. So get the extra movement for their naval units. So the U.S. got a couple of fleets going, strike in a few different directions to give the Japanese some things to worry about. As far as the Far East Command, the Japanese ground units in China itself have been whittled down quite a bit from the war with the Chinese. So the Far East Command felt like it was time to venture out a little bit. So they took Siam, and then they started moving units out of Calcutta itself. So that's a stack of 10 infantry, an artillery, and a tank in Burma. So now the British have the option to move up maybe into Yunnan here and start taking back some Chinese territories for the Chinese. Or maybe even make a push for French Indochina to try to take out that Japanese minor complex. They also came down and used their air force to take out the destroyer and the transport that was in Borneo. So now that Japanese artillery is stuck on Borneo. And they flew back here to Malaya. So the Japanese could try for Malaya this turn, but they only have a transport with 2 infantry. They'd have a couple of shore bombards with a battleship and a cruiser, and then a tactical and a fighter off of this carrier. But the British have 4 infantry there, 3 fighters, and a tactical. So the odds would probably be about 60-40, maybe even 75-25 in the British's favor. So probably not going to do that. They bought 3 tanks and a tactical that they put down in Calcutta, again giving themselves a little bit of an offensive punch down here in Southeast Asia. So it's going to be a race, really, if Japan's going to put enough units into French Indochina with this minor complex to counteract what the Far East Command is coming out with. All these units starting to make its way out of Calcutta. And since the Japanese also have to worry about these 2 U.S. fleets, they're going to also have to spend quite a bit of their money in Tokyo itself. So that's what I'm talking about as far as the Western Allies starting to put pressure on Japan in a couple of different directions here, hopefully to split the attention of the Japanese and make some headway. Also, the Australians went ahead and bought a transport, a destroyer, and a cruiser. And they can also now, starting on turn 5, venture out with this transport and a couple of infantry, maybe start taking some money islands back. Now, obviously, there are a couple of ships aren't, a match for this Japanese Navy here. But then you also got the U.S. up here. And again, it's just the concept of the Western Allies going at the Japanese from a bunch of different directions. And there's no way the Japanese can cover all of that. So a little bit of a bright spot for the Allies heading into turn 5. So turn 5 complete. And taking a look over here in Europe, on the European half of the map, the Germans continue to encroach ever deeper into Russian territory. They took a couple of more territories off the Russians. The Russians did take Belarus back. There was just a single German infantry left in Belarus. So the Russians came down and took that back with some infantry and planes from Leningrad. They also tried to take the Baltic states back with 2 infantry and a tactical. Didn't get any hits. And the Germans ended up taking both infantry off of the Russians, so the tactical retreated. The Germans here in the Crimea, that's a stack of around 30 tanks or so, along with 4 mechs and a couple artillery. So they've got a absolute huge stack of tanks coming. 5 more tanks and 5 more mechs behind that. That's a stack of about a dozen infantry in the western Ukraine. So they're still a couple of territories away from Moscow, but the Germans have absolutely massive forces in southern Russia. These tanks stayed put just because they didn't want to move a step closer to Leningrad with all of that infantry the Russians could have thrown at them. So the tanks stayed back. So did the units in the north. But I wouldn't be surprised if this turn we see the northern part of the Russian invasion taking place. The Russians built 10 men they put in Moscow. So Moscow actually has a ton of defenses. 10 infantry, about 10 mechs, a couple of artillery, and about 20 tanks. So got to see how things play out as far as, do the Russians just stay put and wait for the Germans to get closer and attack Moscow itself and just try to defend, or as the Germans get a little bit closer, maybe Bryansk and Rostov this turn, they then venture out and actually go on the offensive. We'll see how that plays out. Again, Western Europe stayed quiet. Not much at all happened there. In Africa, the British thought about coming into southern France, but they figured they might not be able to hold it. It was only going to be 3 infantry and 3 artillery. So instead of that, they decided to try to finish off the Italians in North Africa. So they took Alexandria. That's been seesaw back and forth the last couple turns. They took Alexandria back, and then they also took Tobruk and wiped out the Italian forces there. So now Italy only has a single artillery left in Africa at all. So at the end of this next turn, you can expect Italy to be completely ejected from North Africa. Italy themselves, they built a man and a fighter. So they do have a nice air force in Rome, 4 fighters and 3 tacticals. And I think Rome is still safe from invasion for a while. Not quite sure the British have the juice to take Rome. But with Africa all but gone, Italy is just reduced to just buying a couple units per turn and doing absolutely nothing else. So that's good news for the Allies. The U.S. actually spent all their money on the east coast of the United States this turn. They bought a tank, 3 transports, a carrier, a tactical, and a fighter. So now they are going to start venturing out on this next turn and applying some pressure on the Germans. So between the British forces in the Med, and they have 3 transports that they can move around, units around, and what the U.S. has coming over from the east coast of the United States, the Germans probably will have to start spending money on the defense of Europe. The British also built 2 strategic bombers they placed in London, so now they are going to start on the next turn doing some strategic bombing. If you remember from a few turns ago, they tried to bomb Paris. They sent in 1 strategic bomber, and the AA gun shot it down. So they're going to give that a try again and see if they can start damaging some of the German factories and taking some money off of them. That's about it for Europe. So overall, Italy is reduced to just about nothing. The U.S. and the British now both have a number of transports. They can start moving some units around, either Normandy, Bordeaux maybe, or maybe the soft underbelly of Europe here. And the Russians are still holding on pretty good. The Germans just inching closer to Moscow, just 1 territory at a time. So Europe, I would say, is far from decided on the European side. In the Pacific, the Japanese are starting to have a whole bunch of headaches here. So the Japanese on their portion of the turn did well. They finished off the Russians in the Soviet Far East. They moved up in northern Russia up here. They also took Novosibirsk. So the Russians are down to just 2 infantry units left in all of their territories on the Pacific side of the map. So that was good. The Japanese also put down another carrier. So now they have 5 loaded carriers in Japan itself. They had sent out a couple more blockers to ward off the U.S. fleet over here. They also came down, and if you remember, they had a fleet down here by Java, but the U.S. fleet that was in the Carolines with some transports kind of scared the Japanese, so they pulled a bunch of stuff back up to the Philippines and actually brought a couple of ships down from the Japanese home waters. So they've got a pretty decent fleet in the Philippines now, a loaded carrier, a battleship, a couple of cruisers, 3 destroyers, a sub, and a transport. So they prevented the U.S. from taking the Philippines back. So that was good news. But other than that, the Japanese are slowly starting to see the money islands fall back into the Allies' hands. The U.S. came over, took Celebes. The Australians came over and took Java. So not only is that $7 worth of territories, but the $5 bonus for having all the money islands. So that right there is costing Japan now $12 a turn. And then the Far East Command is now seriously on the offensive. They moved 10 men into Shan State and took that from Japan. And then they've got 4 tanks, 2 men, and an artillery in Yunnan. So trying to get China back into the game. And if we look into these mainland Chinese territories, Japan has almost nothing here. They've got this artillery in Sichuan. They did put 3 tanks down here in Shanghai in this factory. But this Far East Command force in Yunnan is going to start to be able to take up some of these empty territories before Japan can really respond. So not only taking money off of the Japanese, but getting the Chinese back into the game. And even French Indochina is now in danger. I mean, that's only a minor complex Japan has there. So that's only 3 units a turn they're going to be able to put. For now, they've just got 3 infantry, a couple of tacticals, and 3 fighters. So, and again, the Far East Command is moving forward with a bunch of units. They bought a couple of tanks this turn. They got a decent air force in Burma, a couple of tacticals, and 3 fighters. So Japan has got their hands full in Southeast Asia. And then they also got to try to pick off these Allied transports that are dropping stuff off and taking the money islands back. Australia actually bought a couple of more transports this turn. So again, they're going to start moving stuff around unless this maybe Japanese fleet in the Philippines takes care of that. And ANZAC is actually collecting quite a bit of money. They got $14 worth of territory and then $10 worth of bonuses. And then what complicates things more for Japan, instead of being able to fully concentrate on Southeast Asia and maybe pushing back the Far East Command and taking the money islands back, the U.S. has got this massive fleet just 2 sea zones away from Japan. So that fleet didn't move at all, but the 9 destroyers the U.S. had built the turn before moved up 3 spaces. So now that is just an absolute massive U.S. fleet. More than enough to take care of what the Japan has there. And then the U.S. fleet that was in the Caroline Islands, not much, but it's 3 cruisers and a destroyer pulled back to Hawaii. So now possibly those 2 fleets will combine with each other to take on the Japanese. So Japan could quite possibly have to pull this Philippines fleet back up to Japan itself, and that will in turn leave all of the South Pacific completely open for the Allies to, move their ground units around with the transports they have. So Japan can't even really throw up blockers this turn. They've got, they would have to take out this destroyer in 7, this destroyer in 16, and they really don't have any naval units that are cannon fodder. They got 1 single destroyer, so unless you want to sacrifice a battleship to put it out there or a carrier, then you're probably not going to be able to block the U.S. This turn here in turn 6. So you might see Japan just put down all naval units and then could see a huge clash with this U.S. fleet over here. So we could be in for some serious naval and air warfare on turn 6. Turn 6 complete, and the Allies continue to have a bit more success in this game than previous games. Over here on the Russian front, we had a huge battle in Bryansk. So at the end of the Germany's turn 6 here, they had a stack of about 15 men and 4 artillery in Bryansk. Now, the Russians could have let that stay as it was, But then all of these tanks in Rostov, which are about probably 25 tanks, as well as these tanks and mechs here in Belarus, again, about another 8 tanks and 5 mechs, could have went Bryansk 1, Moscow 2. So the Russians had to take out Bryansk to put up blockers so that the Germans can't reach Moscow this turn 7. So they went out, they used a couple of fighters, a tactical, a couple artillery, and like 12 men, and they did take Bryansk back. But the only thing that's left in Bryansk is an artillery, but it's good enough. It's now a blocker for the Germans. So now all these tanks in Rostov, all these units in Belarus, they can't reach Moscow here on turn 7. There's blockers everywhere they can go. So the Russians pretty much had to sacrifice Leningrad. They still have a decent defense there, about 15 men. But the Germans did move into Karelia and Vyborg in the north. So now they're at the doorstep of Leningrad. And then these tanks and these mechs in Belarus can reach if they want. Plus the entire German Air Force, minus some new units they bought, are up in Finland as well. So Leningrad will probably fall this time, and the Germans probably inch their way a little bit closer to Moscow. The Russians bought 10 men this turn, put them all down in Moscow. So in Moscow, we've got like 10 men, 10 mechs, about 15 tanks, tactical, and a fighter. So some decent defense still available to the Russians in Moscow itself, but they're down to just $21. So it's starting to definitely tilt in Germany's favor on the Russian front. They went ahead and bought 5 tacticals this turn, 5 Stukas, so they're down in Romania. So the Russian front, not so good, other than the battle for Bryansk. Again, the Russians will survive at least 2 turns now. This turn 7 coming up, it's going to take the Germans to inch their way closer to be at a territory adjacent to Moscow, and then maybe an assault on Moscow in turn 8. Other than that, the rest of the board on the European side not looking so good for the Axis. The British went ahead and used a couple of Strat bombers they had, and they bombed the miner factory in Paris. So that took the maximum 6 damage. They also bought 3 more Strat bombers this turn, so now they got a fleet of 5 Strat bombers. So I can see the factory in Berlin or the factory in Western Germany being a target this next turn. Also, the British took a couple more territories away from Italy and North Africa. So now all Italian units are gone from Africa, and they're down to just having Morocco, which will fall. It's an empty territory. It'll fall this next turn to the British. So the British just about have the conquest of Africa done, and then they still have these 3 transports with ground units in North Africa to land somewhere in southern Europe. The U.S. came over. They've got 3 transports here, 3 men, an artillery, a mech, and a tank, and a carrier with a tactical and a fighter. So they're down here off of the coast of Rio de Oro, so they can either come into the Med this turn, or they can even go 1-2 and land up in Normandy, Bordeaux. The U.S. also spent most of their money this turn on units on the east coast of the United States. That's 3 more transports, 3 tanks, 3 men, and a Strat bomber. So that's going to be able to move over here on turn 7 as well. So now Germany, even though the Germans do have a ton of units on the Russian front, pretty much all of their money is now going to have to be spent in the defense of Western Europe, with both the British and the U.S. having plenty of transports and units that they can move around. So I'm not sure if it's going to be a little bit too late to save Moscow, but at least, now the Allies are going to be launching some major strategic bombing raids on German factories, as well as forcing the Germans now to divert all their money to the defense of Western Europe. So we'll see how that plays out. The Italians, not much of anything. They're less than $10. They bought 3 men. So Rome is still pretty heavily defended, but Italy's doing nothing to contribute to the Axis cause whatsoever. In the Pacific, an absolutely huge naval engagement here in the home waters of Japan. So we'll talk about that here in a second. So with the Japanese, they had went back and they took Yunnan from the British, or the Far East Command. They also took a couple more Russian territories up here. So now the Russians have absolutely no units left at all on the Pacific side of the map. And these remaining Russian territories that are worth any money are completely defenseless, so the Japanese will just be able to walk into those. The Japanese did come down and they took Java back. They didn't have enough transports and units to take Celebes, so they're still not getting the bonus for all the money islands. The fleet that was in the Philippines had retreated to Japan, which was a good thing as it turned out. So the Japanese had a pretty big fleet in the Japanese home waters. They also bought a couple battleships. So I believe at the end of the Japanese portion of turn 6, they had 4 battleships, 2 cruisers, 2 destroyers, 6 carriers, with, I believe, a total of 4 tactical and 8 fighters, maybe. So they had quite the fleet. The U.S. then decided to, this fleet here, which are 3 cruisers, a destroyer, a transport with a man and an artillery, they were in Hawaii, so the Japanese had put up blockers, so they couldn't join, they couldn't reach to join in the big naval battle in Japan itself. So they went to Iwo Jima instead, so that took $1 off of Japan. They also landed with some units in the Soviet Far East, so now they have got that buck back for their Russian comrades. And as you see, the Japanese have no ground units at all in the Far East, so these U.S. units will be able to start taking back some of those territories for the Russians. So then, even though it was probably about a 55-45 chance of the Japanese, the odds were in Japan's favor, about 55-45, the U.S. decided to come over from Sea Zone 15 and launch a big air and naval battle there. They could have retreated, but the game is like kind of in the balance right now. Maybe the Axis are ahead by a little bit. So if they would have pulled back, it just would have relieved pressure on Japan. And Japan would have actually been able to just go on the offensive and maybe even go after them. So with the U.S. spending most of their money on the European side of the map, these last couple of turns, they didn't really have units, naval units in the west coast of the United States to reinforce the fleet that was over here in Sea Zone 15. So the U.S. went for it, and they lost, but they inflicted quite a few casualties. The U.S. attacked with 4 loaded carriers, a strat bomber, 10 destroyers, 3 battleships, and a cruiser. So the U.S. lost everything except for the strategic bomber, retreated to the Caroline Islands, but Japan lost all their planes, so a total of 12 planes, both cruisers, both destroyers, and a carrier as well. So all Japan had left is 5 damaged carriers and 4 damaged battleships. So on this next turn here, Japan goes obviously before the United States, so all those units will be repaired free of charge. So I can expect Japan to attack the fleet here on Iwo Jima. But Japan is pretty bare. They have almost no air force, and all their naval units are damaged. And then to add to Japanese misery, the Far East Command then went ahead, took Yunnan back, took Siam, and the big move is they went into French Indochina. The Japanese had, I think, 2 fighters and 4 infantry, and the Far East Command took it rather easily. So not only is that $2, but it wiped out the minor factory Japan had there as well. So even though the Far East Command is only collecting $13 right now, so not a lot of money, if you look over here in mainland China, there's not a lot that the Japanese have. They got 3 tanks here. They did put 3 mechs down in Shanghai, and that's it. So, and Japan's only got this 1 factory on the Chinese mainland to produce units as well. So Japan could easily start to see some of these Chinese territories go back onto the Allied side and get the Chinese back in the fight. Australia, seeing as how Japan has almost no naval units, they've just got a single sub in the South Pacific. The Australians actually built an aircraft carrier this turn and a destroyer, and they already had 5 fighters, so the 2 fighters are already on the aircraft carrier. So the Australians are actually going to be able to start moving around here and go on the offensive in the South Pacific. So the Japanese have a bunch of issues and a lot of different ways they're going to have to spend their money to build back up both their Air Force and their Navy. So the Pacific side of the map is probably about a 50-50 proposition right now. If the U.S. goes ahead and starts spending money in the Pacific again the next couple of turns, I know it'll be to the detriment of the European side of the map, but with the Far East Command in Australia kind of going on the offensive, they might be able to really put the squeeze on Japan heading into turn number 7. So we got turn 7 complete here, and things looking a little bit better for the Allies each turn. Over here in Europe, first we start with the Russian front. That's the one bit of bad news. The Germans had come in and taken the Caucasus. They also took Stalingrad. They also took Leningrad, and they're right at the doorstep to Moscow. The Russians did come back with a force that was in northwest Persia, took the Caucasus back, but with bonuses, Germany was collecting like $83 this last turn, so a huge amount of money for Germany. And again, it looks like the battle for Moscow will take place here on turn 8. So what we've got going on there is about 30, 32, 35 German tanks, 5 mechs. And then you've got these 5 Stukas that can reach, these 4 Stukas, and these 2 strategic bombers that can reach. The Russians, in turn, have a couple of AA guns to fire at the planes. And they've got about 10 mechs, about 18 tanks, and about 20 men. So probably a German victory, I would say, but I think it's going to be a little bit of a slugfest. If Moscow does fall, it's going to be extremely difficult for the Allies, at least on the European side of the board, to come back. The Germans, because of the threat that both the United States and the British were posing, they went ahead and built 10 tanks, spent all their money in Western Europe. They put them in West Germany. They also moved a couple fighters back. The British then went ahead and strategically bombed Berlin. So that's 20 damage, the maximum damage that factory can take. They did lose 1 strategic bomber for their trouble, but still, now Germany has 2 of their 3 factories that are in Europe bombed to the maximum. Besides that, the British finished off the conquest of Africa. They moved everything back here. So now these 3 transports are in a position to take all these ground units somewhere, probably not Rome necessarily, but somewhere here in southern Europe. The U.S. also landed. They landed in southern France. Not much of a force, 3 men, mech, a tank, and an artillery. But the Germans could come down with these tanks, move 1, 2, and wipe it out, which will probably happen this turn. But the U.S. have another force coming of 3 men and 3 tanks. The British also built 3 transports so they can start moving some of their stuff over from London, built a couple of destroyers to protect the transports. So both the U.S. and the British now have a handful of transports and a handful of ground units that they can come at Western Europe in a few different directions. So the Germans really need to finish off the Russians here on turn 8 so they can devote all their attention to Western Europe. Italy, again, they're only collecting $8, but they were able to build another fighter this turn. So they've got like 5 or 6 fighters, 3 tactical bombers, about a dozen men and a tank. So really Rome is pretty secure. I can see on this turn maybe a strategic bombing run into Rome, but then you have to deal with the British or the Italian fighters as defense. So not sure how that's going to play out. The Allies not too concerned about Italy just because they're like turtled up into Rome, so no worries there. But a lot's going to happen or determine how things play out depending on how Moscow goes this turn. If the Russians can somehow survive that, the Germans aren't going to have much left in the way of ground units. And with everything the Western Allies are bringing into Western Europe, it could give the Russians the time they need to kind of build themselves back up. So we'll see how things play out in Europe. On the Pacific side of the map, the Japanese, again, dealing with threats from all different directions. They came down and took out the U.S. fleet that was in Iwo Jima. 3 of their carriers received damage, but the U.S. isn't in a position with any units to take out those carriers, so they'll be able to get back to Japan to repair themselves. The Japanese built a couple of transports and 3 fighters, and they put 3 more tanks down in Shanghai. The 3 transports, they want to start moving some of these men from Japan around the board. They also moved a couple guys into Amur. They got to start putting up blockers so this U.S. force in the Soviet Far East doesn't encroach any further into conquered territory. And then a little bit of a back and forth again. Yunnan was taken back by Japan. Then the Far East Command took it back again. Far East Command also took this territory here, Guangxi. So now there's 2 Chinese territories that have been liberated. Japan does not have much in China at all. They got the 3 new tanks they put down, 3 mechs moved up, a strategic and tactical bomber, and a fighter, and that's it. So Japan has got to start putting more units into China to counter the Far East Command. Although the Far East Command doesn't have a whole lot going on down here either. They've been degraded pretty good these last couple of turns. They built 3 mechs this turn to move a couple of spaces to back up the units they got there. They got a decent air force down here, so it's kind of a back and forth down in Southeast Asia. The Japanese, though, have no Navy in the South Pacific at all, so Anzac went ahead and built another carrier, so now they have 2 aircraft carriers loaded with 2 fighters each on the board. So pretty good position Anzac is in. They came over and took Java back from Japan, and that's 2 transports with 3 infantry and an artillery. So they're definitely going to be able to take these last couple of money islands back from Japan, and Japan has no units down in the South Pacific to take them back. So Japan's got all kinds of headaches both on the Chinese mainland and with all the islands down in the South Pacific. The U.S. went ahead, spent this turn all their money in the Pacific. They built a couple of battleships, 2 cruisers and a destroyer. So they're trying to build a navy back up. Probably going to be a race to see between them and the Japanese who can build up a fleet first. And with Japan having to worry so much about the Far East Command and Anzac, this might tilt into the U.S.'s favor heading into turn 8. So quite a few developments on turn 8 here. And I think the conflict has finally fully swung into the Allies' favor. I think we might actually get our first Allied victory here. So taking a look at the Russian front, as you can see, there are still Russians on the board. So Germany came into Moscow on their turn here, turn 8, and didn't roll so good. And Moscow held with quite a few units. The Germans lost altogether 2 Stukas, 2 strategic bombers, 5 mechs, and about 35 tanks. The Russians lost about 10 tanks, about 15 men, about 15 mechs. So at the end of the battle, the Russians still had like 10 tanks still there. So Germans were totally wiped out. Definitely made a mistake with Germany. Didn't bring all of the air units that I could have brought into Moscow. Thought it was going to be enough as it was, and wanted to kind of use some air units to fly to Western Europe, and that definitely cost the Germans. And now with Moscow still holding on, it's going to be extremely difficult for the Germans to take Russia out. As you can see, on Russia's turn, they moved out a little bit, took a few territories back. They had even come out and taken Novosibirsk back from the Japanese with a single tank that was left. They took Bryansk, Tambov, Volgorod, Rostov, Smolensk. The Russians still aren't collecting that much money. They're only up to like $18, but the main thing was Moscow held. And as you can see, the Germans don't have a whole heck of a lot left on the Eastern Front. They got mostly air power. They got a few men and artillery in Belarus, along with 5 Stukas. And then down in Romania, they've got 5 mechs, a couple of Stukas, and 4 fighters. They do have a couple of mechs in the Caucasus, but other than the air power, nothing can reach Moscow for several turns. And that'll just give, obviously, Russia a couple of turns worth of putting just infantry simply down in Moscow and trying to hold on. So have serious doubts whether the Germans are going to be able to take Moscow. Obviously, they're going to have to put more units down here in Romania, but again, that's going to take several turns for them to get there. And the Germans got all kinds of trouble in Western Europe besides. So not looking good for Germany. And then if we look over here in Western Europe, the invasion of France, the re-entry onto the continent from the Western Allies has begun. So the U.S. landed first in Normandy, Bordeaux. It was unopposed, 3 infantry, 3 tanks. The British came down and reinforced that with 5 more men, a mech, and a couple of fighters. So Normandy, Bordeaux is pretty heavily defended, and the Germans have absolutely nothing to eject them. The British also came over here and landed in southern France from the units they had in the Mediterranean. That was, I believe, 5 infantry and a tank. The Germans had like 6 tanks there and got like no hits. The shore bombardment that the British had with the battleship and the cruisers took out a couple units. The planes took out the rest, and the Germans got no hits in return. So 2 French territories had fallen to the Western Allies. And then we finally saw an appearance of Italy for the first time in about 4 or 5 turns. The Italians actually did something. So it wasn't much, but they had a tank that could reach southern France from Rome, so that went 1, 2, and then all their air units, which they had 5 fighters and 3 tactical bombers. They took out all the British units in southern France, and the Italians only lost 1 unit. They sacrificed a fighter just so they could actually claim southern France. So now there's a little bit of a blocker there, so that these ground units in Normandy, Bordeaux can't go through southern France into northern Italy. So Italy contributed a little bit there. They built 3 men and put them down in Rome, so Rome's pretty heavily defended. Also, the British went ahead and bombed Western Germany and did the maximum 20 damage on that major factory. So now all 3 German factories in Western Europe, Paris, a minor factory, bombed to the maximum of 6, and Germany and Western Germany, major factories, each bombed to the maximum of 20. So not only did Moscow not fall, and the Germans got to put more units onto the Eastern Front to try to finally take out the Russians. You got the Western Allies landed in Normandy, Bordeaux, and the Germans having no chance to eject them anytime soon. But all their factories are bombed to the maximum, so if they want to put units into Western Europe, they've got to pay off the damage to the factory first. And I think they are collecting quite a bit. I think they got like around $80 or so last turn with bonuses. But still, nonetheless, they've got so many things to worry about now that the $20 they're going to have to pay off on one of these major factories is definitely going to be a big dent in the units they can put down. The U.S. split their money. They bought 3 more transports and 6 men, so they'll be able to hit Western Europe in 2 turns. And that was about it for Western Europe. In the Pacific theater, things not looking a whole lot better for the Japanese, or the Axis, I should say. So the Japanese came up here. They took out the U.S. units in the Soviet Far East, but they didn't have any ground units left to take it. But the main thing was just to wipe out those U.S. units so they could just continue to advance into these Far Eastern Russian territories and take those back for the Russians. So they did take out that force. This Japanese strategic bomber came out and took out the Russian tank in Novosibirsk, and the tank didn't get a hit in return. And the main thing that Japan wanted to do with that is just so that if they would have left that tank there, then it would have been able to start moving into all these vacant territories occupied by Japan. So they didn't want that tank to kind of maraud its way through these empty Japanese territories. They took out that tank. Then they did land down here in Kwang Sea with quite a force. They had some men that came up from the Japanese home islands on transports, came down here. They also took Yunnan back. That continues to just go back and forth. But as you can see, Japan now has almost nothing left by the end of turn 8 down here. So the Far East Command came back, took Yunnan with force. That's 4 men, 4 mechs, and a tank. And the Japanese did hold on to Kwang Sea. The Far East Command came in with 3 fighters, 2 tacticals, and a bunch of men. And the Japanese inflicted quite a few casualties. They kept Kwang Sea, took out all the men and 2 of the fighters. So that was like kind of a decent victory for the Japanese. But if you look on the entire Chinese mainland, they've got some stuff here in Shanghai, 3 mechs, a tactical, a strategic, and a fighter. And that's really about it. So even though the Far East Command doesn't have a whole lot, this force in Yunnan is going to start spreading out here on this turn 9, taking these territories back from Japan. Not a whole lot Japan can do about that. Also, the Australians, Anzac, they took Sumatra back from Japan, so now the only money island they have left is Borneo, and that'll fall on this next turn. That's a decent naval force the Australians have off of Sumatra. And then they went ahead and built yet another carrier. So that's the 3rd Australian carrier on the board. You don't see that too often. And it already has 2 fighters on it. So Australia altogether has 3 carriers with a total of 6 fighters on them. And again, the Japanese have no units at all in the South Pacific. So nothing Japan can do about that. The U.S. went ahead and spent part of their money in the east, the west here, and the rest of it here in the west. They bought a carrier, a couple of fighters, a destroyer, and a sub. So they're trying to build a fleet back up. The Japanese had built 2 battleships, and a fighter. So that went in the Japanese home waters along with the 3 mechs they put down in Shanghai. So that's how things look after turn 8. The Japanese, basically their plans right now, they do have a nice navy in the Japanese home waters. That's 6 battleships and 5 carriers. These 3 are damaged, but they will be repaired this turn here, turn 9. But they have really only 2 planes total for the 5 carriers, and they have almost no ground units left on the board whatsoever. Japan's going to have to keep putting money into Shanghai and probably have to bring down this navy to maybe wipe out the Australians, but then that leaves this U.S. fleet off the west coast free to kind of do damage. And as far as how things look for the Axis in the European side of the map, Germany has no choice. They're going to have to pay off damage on one of these factories. They've got to put units in Western Europe this turn. So between paying off the damage and let's say they drop 10 mechs, that's $60 right there. They're only going to have about $20 or so to put on the Eastern Front. I just don't think the Germans are going to be able to get to Moscow in time to be able to take the Russians out. It'll take at least a couple of turns. By then the Russians, even if they're only collecting, $18, $20 a turn, that's 6, 7 men a turn they're placing down in Moscow. I just don't think that those odds are going to be in Germany's favor. And now that the Western allies are starting to land enforced in Western Europe, the Germans are in trouble that way from that direction as well. So we'll see if the Axis can mount a little bit of a comeback here on turn 9. So turn 9 is done, and at the first portion of the turn, it looked like things were improving a little bit for the Axis, which is to be expected. Germany and Japan go 1 and 3 in the turn sequence each round. But by the end of this whole turn 9, things are looking bleak for the Axis. So first with Germany, they went ahead and took several territories back on the Eastern Front that the Russians had ventured out from Moscow. They also put 10 mechs down in Romania, and they moved a couple of fighters from West Germany. So these mechs aren't going to be able to reach Moscow on this turn. The Russians did put up blockers. But at this point, the Germans have altogether 16 mechs on the Eastern Front, a few infantry and artillery, and about 7 fighters and 6 Stukas. So Moscow still could fall. The Russians are only collecting, at this point, they're down to $11. So they only collect enough income to produce maybe about 4 infantry per turn. The Germans aren't going to be able to attack Moscow here on turn 10, but possibly turn 11. And I think with what the Germans have on the board on the Eastern Front, Moscow might fall on turn 11. Also on this turn 10 coming up, no sense in Germany putting ground units down in Romania, because if they plan on taking Moscow, or at least attempting to take Moscow on turn 11, these ground units wouldn't reach Moscow. So they're going to probably build, they collected $80-something last turn, so they're probably going to build 7 fighters, so that the fighters, 1, 2, 3, could possibly reach on turn 11. So they're probably buying all air units this turn. If not fighters, then strategic bombers that can move 6 spaces, so they'd be able to hit Moscow on turn 11. So that's going to be kind of go for broke. If the Germans can take Moscow on turn 11, then they still have a chance. If not, then the Allies are going to totally win this game. In Western Europe is where things are looking extremely bleak. The Germans had paid off the $20 worth of damage in Western Germany, and then Britain bombed it back for 20. They did lose 1 strategic bomber in the meantime. The big news is the U.S. put 1 unit into Holland, Belgium, so that took $3 off of Germany, and then they walked into Paris and took that back for the French. So now the French have been reactivated. So now all the territories, the original French territories that were held by the Allies, go back to France. They were able to put $12 worth of units in Paris for the liberation. So they put 4 infantry down. The British then came and moved their units into Paris. So right now in Paris, you've got, between the U.S., British, and French, you have about 10 infantry, 3 tanks, a mech, a tactical bomber, and like 8 fighters. So there's no way Germany's going to be able to take Paris back this turn 10. They just don't have the units for it. The U.S. also is coming over with 6 more infantry here. They put 3 tanks and 3 men down, and these 3 transports are going to make their way over and pick them up. So kind of a convoy system of U.S. units coming over. The British built another transport. The 3 transports they had on the board dropped off 6 men in Normandy, Bordeaux, and the British have 3 tanks and 5 men ready to come over on these 4 transports this next turn. So the U.S. and the British together are just pumping units into Western Europe. Germany really doesn't have the ability to eject them. In Western Germany, the Germans have about 5 infantry, 5 mechs, 6 tanks, and 2 artillery. So they're obviously going to have to pay off the damage in Western Germany this turn and again put some units there. But they also got to, again, put some units on the Eastern Front to try to finish off Russia. So it's really kind of pick your poison for Germany. The British backed off this fleet here. They took the fighters that were on these carriers and moved them into Paris. Defending Paris was more important than this fleet. But they still have 2 carriers, which take 2 hits apiece, a battleship, and 3 cruisers. So the Italian Air Force really isn't in a position to take out this fleet, even without the fighter protection for the carriers. The Italians built 4 infantry and put them in northern Italy, and they also moved up 10 men that were in southern Italy to northern Italy. So now the Italians actually have about 15 men and a tank in northern Italy. So they can go on the offensive the next turn into France, and they still have the 3 tactical bombers and the 4 fighters. So Italy actually has a little bit of a force they can reach the Western Allies with in France on turn 10. That was about it on the Eastern Front, or on the European side of the map. And on the Pacific side, things are just as bleak for the Axis. Japan took Novosibirsk back, and the Soviet Far East, so that got them a couple of dollars. They also moved part of their fleet down into the Philippines, so that's 4 battleships, 2 carriers, 2 fighters, a destroyer, and a sub. And being at the naval base in the Philippines, they can move 3 spaces, so probably going to expect a major naval battle here on turn 10. They also built 3 tanks. They pulled everything back to Shanghai to kind of regroup. They've now got 4 tanks, 3 mechs, 2 strategic bombers, a fighter, and a tactical in Shanghai. But as you can see, the Far East Command is spreading out through all these vacant Chinese territories. So now China's also back into the game. So the Allies have got both the French and the Chinese back in the game here on turn 9. And even though there's not much there, it's mostly just a single man and a single mech in each of these territories. Japan really doesn't have much that can reach them, especially like, let's say, this mech over here can just continue to take vacant territories back from Japan. And Japan's actually down to just $42 they collected by the end of turn 9 here. The Japanese did build 3 transports, and they've got 7 men. So you can imagine these men will come down on these transports, 1, 2, 3, land down here, maybe in French Indochina, Guangxi, maybe take Kwangtung back. So Japan has a few options. But the Anzac fleet, they couldn't escape the Japanese, so they put everything they had here into the sea zone outside of Java. So now, with this French destroyer, they've got a total of 3 destroyers, a cruiser, 3 carriers with 6 fighters. This Japanese force consists of, again, 4 battleships, 2 carriers, 2 planes, sub, and a destroyer. So it's actually probably about maybe 60-40 Japan would win that, but it's going to take most of that Japanese fleet to take out the Australian Navy there. And the U.S. came over. They've got a fleet in the Hawaiian Islands of 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 2 destroyers, 2 subs, and a carrier with 2 fighters. So that's probably more than enough to take out what Japan has left in the Japanese home waters. They do have a couple battleships and 3 carriers, but no planes. And again, the Japanese didn't collect a whole lot of money last turn, and they're going to have to continue to put money into Shanghai. So those carriers are kind of defenseless, and I'm not sure they're going to have the money to put too many planes on those carriers this turn. So a lot of problems for the Axis across the board here, from Europe to the Pacific. See if the Axis can mount a little bit of a comeback here on turn 10. So we've got turn 10 complete, and this is definitely a little bit of a back and forth game here. At the end of turn 9, it looks like the Allies had really taken control. And now, at the end of turn 10, it looks like things have swung back into the Axis favor a little bit. The big development is here on the Eastern Front. It looks like Moscow will probably fall this turn. So what Germany did was they bought 4 strategic bombers. They paid off some of the damage, 15 of the 20 damage in Western Germany, and put down 5 infantry in Western Germany. So the reason why the strategic bombers here is because they want to attack Moscow here on turn 11, and no other air units or ground units would have been able to make Moscow. So that was the reason for buying the 4 strategic bombers. Then up here, the Germans went ahead with the 10 mechs they had in Romania and came up 1-2 to Belarus. And the reason why they did that, as opposed to going southwards towards Moscow, is now they could come in from 2 territories now, Bryansk and Smolensk, to attack Moscow. So if the Russians wanted to prevent these 10 mechs from being able to reach here on turn 11, they would have had to take out both Bryansk and Smolensk to throw up blockers against these 10 mechs. The Germans also, they had moved up all the remaining infantry, 4 infantry here, and then landed all their planes there. So the Russians could have possibly went into Smolensk. They had 8 tanks, like 8 men, a tactical, and a fighter. So that could have possibly taken Smolensk back, and then obviously taken out all these German planes. There's about 7 Stukas and 7 fighters would have been great. But then the only thing that would have been left in Moscow is, assuming the 2 planes survived, they would have flown back, and they had 4 men they could put down, and that's it. And it doesn't block these 10 mechs from reaching. So then these 10 mechs would have just bypassed Smolensk, went to Bryansk, then into Moscow, along with the 4 strategic bombers and these 6 mechs there. So that would have been 16 mechs and 4 strategic bombers against a couple of planes and 4 men. So there's no way that would have went in Russia's favor. And they didn't have enough units to take out both Bryansk and Smolensk, so they decided to just turtle up and hope for the best. Probably not going to happen, though. The Germans, again, have a really strong air force to move in unless the Russian AA guns get extremely lucky. So I think we might finally see Moscow fall here, turn 11. On the Western Front, not really any combat. The U.S. moved a bunch more units up to Belgium, Holland, so things are getting really crowded there. So that's about 8 men, 3 tanks, a couple of fighters, and a tactical, along with 5 British infantry and 3 British tanks. So a bunch of units in Belgium, Holland. And then in Paris is, between the Allies combined, 16 infantry, a tactical, a mech, and like 8 fighters. So both Paris and Belgium, Holland are securely in the Allies' hands. You could see an assault on Western Germany this turn. Although since Moscow's probably going to fall, all the German resources will probably put into Western Germany this turn. The British did try to strategically bomb Western Germany again. It still had 5 damage. The Germans didn't pay off. So the British sent in 3 strategic bombers, and the Germans got 2 hits, 2 of 3 hits with the AA. So just 1 British strategic bomber survived. It did do 5 damage, but at the cost of 2 strategic bombers, definitely not worth it. Italy thought about going into Paris. They had about 14 men, a tank, plus they would have been able to bring 4 fighters and 3 tacticals. But the Allies had more units defending at higher die rolls, so they decided against that. So they just brought some more men up. So Northern Italy now has about 17 men in a tank. So depending on how things go at the beginning here at turn 11, Italy might actually go on the offensive at the end of the turn. The U.S. has more units coming over, 3 tanks, 3 men. The British have, I believe, 4 tanks and 4 men in London ready to come over. So the convoy system's still going on. The British came back here to Cairo with their entire fleet so they can move these 3 artillery over this turn. But if Moscow does fall this turn, it's going to be hard, even with everything the U.S. and the British are putting into the Western Front, for the Allies to take down Germany and Italy, I think, on the European side of the map. On the Pacific side, kind of hit or miss over here for both the Axis and the Allies. Japan had come back and taken a bunch of the territories here in South China, and then the Far East Command came back and took a few of them in return. Japan built 3 planes. They all put in Shanghai, so they got 3 fighters, 2 tacticals, and 2 strategic bombers, so a pretty nice air force in Shanghai. They also brought men down from Japan, landed in French Indochina and Kwangtung. So the Far East Command is getting stretched a little thin here. They don't have much left. Probably going to have to start pulling back. Hopefully the Western Allies will be able to intervene before that happens. But there's not much left in terms of ground units for the Far East Command. Big naval battle in Java. So the Japanese came down with 2 carriers, 2 fighters, a destroyer, and 4 battleships. They took on 3 destroyers, a cruiser, 3 carriers, and 6 planes. And the Japanese got the worst of that. Took out all 3 carriers and a couple of destroyers, but they lost everything but 4 battleships, and all 4 battleships were damaged. So they retreated to Borneo, the sea zone here off of Borneo. The 6 Anzac planes landed on Java because the Australians own Java now. So then on Anzac's portion of the turn, they then went into Borneo, and Japan repaid them in kind. The Australians had a really crappy die rolls on the first round of combat. They got 1 hit. So they ended up taking out 2 of the 4 battleships, and Japan also had a sub that was here too. So the Japanese lost 2 battleships and a sub, and Australia lost the cruiser, the destroyer, and all 6 planes. So not so good for the Australians. They did buy another battleship and a destroyer, so they got a couple battleships and a couple destroyers ready to come out from Sydney. The U.S. went ahead and got a fleet now off of Iwo Jima, so they're right at the doorstep of Tokyo. They don't have any transport, so none of these ground units can reach that are in Iwo Jima, but they got a couple battleships, a loaded carrier, 3 cruisers, 2 subs, and 2 destroyers, and Japan has no naval units at all. So the U.S. kind of has free will here in the Central Pacific. They also have a loaded carrier and a cruiser that also can reach Japanese home waters on this next turn. And they went ahead and built 4 transports with men and mechs in western United States. So they're going to start bringing them over. Not sure they're going to be able to reach Japan in time. Japan's not collecting that much money. They're only collecting like $52. So I'm not sure what Japan's strategy is going to be, if they're just going to buy ground units to defend Tokyo or try to put some kind of navy here. They really don't have a lot left for a navy. They got 2 damaged battleships, 2 fully functional battleships, some transports, and 4 carriers. But the carriers are 3 carriers, but they don't have any planes. So not sure how that's going to play out. The U.S. might have finally got the upper hand in terms of naval warfare in the Pacific. So we'll see what happens here on turn 11, see if Moscow finally falls, and that tips the balance in the Axis favor for good. So turn 11 has been wrapped up, and things are still very much up in the air. The big news on the Eastern Front is Moscow fell. So, and there's still about 10 German mechs left there in Moscow. And then the planes moved back more towards the border with Romania, trying to get that German Air Force in position to attack the Western Allies here on turn number 12. And Moscow doesn't, or the Russians don't have any units left on the board whatsoever. So they've been completely knocked out of the game, at least for the time being. So that really tilted things into the Axis' favor on the European side of the map. The U.S. continuing to try to shuttle units over. The British actually landed up in Norway, seeing that there was no German units up in the northern part of Europe, plus it takes a $5 bonus off of Germany. So basically it was an $8 swing, or at least $8 they took off of Germany, the $3 for Norway and the $5 bonus. Plus the British thinking maybe they can get up into northern Russia. But again, those 10 German mechs or so are still in Moscow. So they're just going to probably come over to Leningrad here on this next turn. So probably blocking the British off, but at least temporarily took some decent money off of the Germans. The British built 3 men they put in Cairo. So now they have those 3 transports with 3 men and 3 artillery ready to move. And then they put down some more ground units in London to start bringing over as well. The Germans, for their buy, spent everything in Western Germany. So now they have a stack of about 20 men, half a dozen mechs, half a dozen tanks. They got 5 more mechs coming from Berlin because they paid down some of the damage on that factory. So this was the problem that was going to confront the Western Allies if Moscow did fall, is now Germany, who was collecting with bonuses the last few turns about $80 or so, is going to spend all their money in Western Europe. And it's just difficult for the Western Allies to keep up, considering they have to bring all their units over by transport. So I'm probably going to start to see some of these French territories that have been liberated swing back into German control. The Italians actually went ahead and attacked Paris this turn. Now, they didn't take Paris, and they had to retreat the remaining planes, but they took off about 18 infantry and a mech. So now Paris is down to 3 tanks that the French just put down, 1 infantry, 1 tactical, and 8 fighters. But Germany has more than enough to probably take Paris this turn and also eject the Western Allies from Belgium, Holland. So Germany probably going to take both of those territories back, and for the second time in the game, knock the French out. The Italians just built some infantry they put in southern Rome. So they have about 7 infantry, 4 fighters, and 2 tacticals. So probably enough to ward off what the British have coming. Plus, the Germans are probably going to fly these 5 fighters down into Rome this turn as well to beef up their defenses. So I don't see Italy falling. So on the European side of the map, things looking a lot better for the Axis. Conversely, in the Pacific, things are looking very grim for the Japanese. If we take a quick scan of the Pacific, there's not a single Japanese ship left on the board. The U.S. came over here, another major naval engagement off of Okinawa, and completely wiped out that Japanese fleet. It was 3 battleships, 3 carriers, about 4 planes, a cruiser, and 3 transports. The U.S. lost quite a bit as well. All the planes that engaged in the battle flew back to Iwo Jima. But the main thing was they completely wiped out that Japanese fleet there. The U.S. built a couple carriers with 4 planes. They also came down here with these 4 transports. They got 5 men and 3 mechs, which could reach Japan on this next turn. So Japan's going to probably have to think about just straight up defending Tokyo itself. In China, the Japanese do have a little bit of an air force left here in Shanghai, but those might have to retreat to Tokyo to defend that. Besides that, they just got a couple of tanks, a mech, and some men. Now, the Far East Command doesn't have a lot going on either. They bought all infantry in India. But Japan really probably has to spend all their money in Tokyo this turn, or at least the majority of it. So Japan is definitely starting to get squeezed. Anzac even came out with a couple battleships and a couple destroyers and took out the 2 damaged Japanese battleships in Java and didn't receive any damage in return. So between Anzac and the United States, they completely rule the Pacific Ocean. Could just be a matter of time before Tokyo itself is under threat. The only good news is that now with Moscow having fallen, the Axis are probably going to start going on a rampage on the European side of the map, maybe diverting most of the U.S. money on that side of the globe. And who knows, maybe even the Germans can start coming down through southern Russia into the Middle East, threatening Africa or India from that direction as well. See how things play out after turn 12. So turn 12 is done, and the game continues to just go back and forth. A little bit of good, a little bit of bad for both the Axis and the Allies this turn. So the Germans, seeing that the British had landed in Norway, moved their stack of 10 mechs and about 7 Stukas up into Archangel. So now they put themselves in position that they can take out the British here that were trying to advance into northern Russia. So because of that, the British just put 1 infantry in Finland. They left the tanks and the men in Norway for now. They want to continue that push into northern Russia. They could have retreated those units off, but they're not in danger this turn. So the British definitely thinking about here on turn 13 going ahead and landing more units in Norway. They want to stretch the German resources out and kind of hit the Germans from a couple of different directions, so the Germans can't just concentrate on one spot in Europe. Besides that, the Germans didn't have a whole lot of success. They went into France, tried to take Paris. They also went into Holland, Belgium, and they lost everything in France, and there was still 4 British fighters left. They did take out everything in Holland, Belgium, but they lost everything in return, so they didn't even take that. So a couple of defeats for the Germans in Western Europe this turn. They went ahead, put 9 tanks and a mech in Western Germany, and then 3 tanks and 2 mechs in Berlin. That was the maximum they could put in each of those territories, because Berlin did have 5 damage on it. They also flew the fighters that were in southern Russia down here into Rome. So they added about 6 fighters to Rome's defense. So that was too much for the British to try to take. The British did land in southern France. So that's 3 men and 3 artillery. And they got a bunch of naval units off the coast of southern France there. So that took $3 off of Italy. The U.S. landed back into Holland, Belgium with some units. They also built more men and tanks that'll be coming over here on turn 13. Won't be able to reach, though, until turn 14. The British built some more infantry, and they brought their transports that had landed the units in Norway down. So they'll be in a position here on turn 14 to be able to land back in Europe with a bunch of units. The French just did what they could, which is 3 infantry they put down. So Paris will probably fall this turn now for the second time in the game. The Italians didn't do anything. The British took off the infantry that was in northern Italy at no loss to themselves. The Italians built 2 tanks, and they put them down into southern Italy. So that's about it for the European side of the map. So, I mean, if you look around Europe, as well as even in Russia, there's no country really has that many ground units in Europe. So it could kind of go either way. The Germans are collecting at the end of their portion of the turn. They were, with bonuses, collecting $75. They still have far and away the most money, at least when you consider the U.S. dividing up where they spend their money. So they more than double the British right now. Italy just hanging on there with like $8. So the U.S. did take their 3 strategic bombers and bomb Western Germany, so that's 19 worth of damage. So the Germans are going to have to pay that off before they can put any units down. But it looks like Germany's going to be able to take France back, and should be able to take Holland, Belgium. So the Allies will be down to just southern France as far as territories in Western Europe this turn. So the advantage still lies with the Axis. They currently have 6 of the victory cities. They need 8. They should take, again, Paris back this turn, so that would give them 7. But then the remaining victory cities are all out of reach. One's Cairo, not even close to taking that. Even if the Germans or the Italians brought their air force down and wiped out these couple of infantry, they currently have no ground units that could take it. London completely secure, Washington secure, and Ottawa completely secure. So still a ways away, I think, from an Axis victory on this side of the map. Over in the Pacific, things even worse for the Axis. Japan built 3 mechs they put into this minor factory in Shanghai, a couple of infantry and 4 fighters they put in Japan. Now, they did come back and they took a couple of territories off the Far East Command. For the second time in the game, completed the conquest of all of China. They did move into Shan State, took Siam back. But as you can see, they hardly have any ground units in China at all. They have a little bit of an air force. But by the time they even get to Calcutta, which is a turn or 2 away, the Far East Command are dropping 5 infantry a turn. So there's pretty much no way Japan will be able to take India. They'll probably take Malaya this turn. There's only a single infantry there, but not even sure they're going to be able to hold that for long. And besides that, they have not a single naval unit on the board, and both the U.S. and ANZAC continue to put naval units on the board. So the Allies have complete control of the Pacific. The U.S. did bomb this minor factory for 4 damage. So the Japanese will have to pay that off before they can put some units down. They backed off their 2 damaged battleships down to the Philippines, which is still Japanese controlled. But as you can see over here in the Caroline Islands, the U.S. got a carrier and 4 transports with a bunch of men and some mech. So we can see the Philippines almost definitely being recaptured by the U.S. this turn. They also have a nice Air Force presence in Iwo Jima, and they got a couple loaded carriers in Hawaii. They also built 4 transports and 8 men this turn, so they're going to start moving those guys over. And again, with Japan not having any naval units on the board, the U.S. is able to move units around at will. The Australians came here, landed in Java, took that. So that's $4 up for them. They also built a carrier and landed the 2 planes they had in Sydney on that carrier. So even with a carrier, 3 destroyers, and 2 battleships, that's a massive naval presence in comparison to what the Japanese have, which is nothing. So, and now all the money islands are in Allied control. Japan still collecting a decent amount of money. They were at like $61, but no bonuses. So, and again, Japan's got to worry about a possible invasion of Tokyo and doing what they can to hold on to China. But they really don't have the resources to spend in China. So they're probably at this point just going to try to hold on and hope that the Axis can gain the upper hand in Europe and maybe complete an Axis victory that way. If not, then I can definitely see both the U.S. and Australia buying transports and ground units and start landing maybe on the Chinese mainland, maybe up into the Soviet Far East, and start taking back those territories from Japan. They're definitely in rough shape heading into turn 13. So turn 13 finished off, and we continue to see a little bit of back and forth. In Europe, Paris, Germans took Paris. Then the British came up from southern France and took that back. They had just a single artillery left, and they lost a bunch of planes as well. The Germans also had taken Holland, Belgium. They mostly bought infantry they placed in Western Germany. They also put a couple of fighters in Berlin. They also backed off 4 tactical bombers from the Eastern Front into Berlin. So they've got a decent air force between West Germany and Berlin itself, but not much in the way of ground units. Southern France was vacant, so the Italians came up and took that. Also, the British left the Med. Now, they didn't want to give the $5 bonus to Italy for no Allied surface ships in the Med, but they needed to get these units up into England to start transporting more units over. And if they would have split up the fleet and left part of it here in the Med to prevent the Italians from getting that bonus, the Italians have 2 tacticals and 4 fighters, so that would have been more than enough to take off part of this fleet if it was left behind. So rather than sacrifice all those ships, they just moved everything out of the Med. So now it's making its way back to London to load up these 3 transports. But it did give Italy the $5 bonus back, as well as Italy taking southern France. So a little bit of a resurgence from Italy. They actually brought home $16 this last turn. Didn't spend anything from the turn before. So they'll have $24 here on turn number 14. Or turn 13. I'm starting to lose count. This is the longest game I've had so far here. Besides that, the British landed units in Norway again, so they've got a stack of about 12 men and a half a dozen tanks. So not too bad in Norway. The Germans trying to block them with these 10 mechs and 2 tacticals in Leningrad. The U.S. came over, so they're just outside of London with 3 men and 3 armor. Also, these 3 transports making their way back to the eastern United States. The problem for the Western Allies is in minus Norway, in Western Europe, they just have a single artillery down. So it's going to be tough for the Western Allies to land back in Europe and actually stay. They didn't bother bombing Western Germany. The Germans had paid off the $19 of damage this turn. they didn't bother bombing it because the Germans got 6 fighters there. So in addition to having to survive the anti-aircraft of the factory, they've got 6 fighters there as well. So there wasn't any additional strategic bombing raids on German factories this last turn. The Germans also moved a couple of mechs that were in Romania here into the Ukraine. So you can see this next turn they'll move down 2 more spaces to the Caucasus, and then the following turn they'd be in a position to take Persia, maybe activate the pro-Axis territory of Iraq. So the British are probably going to have to start spending some money in Egypt to prevent the Germans from coming down through the Middle East. In the Pacific, pretty much the status quo. The Japanese built 4 more fighters, so now they have a stack of about 8 fighters and about 15 men in Japan. So they have quite the defense in Tokyo itself. They put 3 tanks down in Shanghai, and they had taken Malaya. And they've got a decent force in central China here, some planes and some mechs. But again, they continue to have no ships in the Pacific at all. The U.S. went over here and took the Philippines back, and they've got 4 transports with 5 men and 3 mechs. So they're going to be able to land anywhere they want on the Chinese coast this turn. The U.S. also has a couple carriers and 3 strategic bombers in the Caroline Islands. And then they have in Hawaii a couple of fighters and 4 more transports with 8 men. So the U.S. has quite a bit of offensive power. These 2 damaged battleships will be repaired this turn because they're now at a naval base. The U.S. also went ahead and built 7 strategic bombers they placed in western United States. So probably we're not far away, maybe a couple of turns away from a invasion of Tokyo. Far East Command just trying to hold on until Australia and the United States can apply pressure to Japan. They just built 5 men they placed in India. So really Calcutta is not in any danger. And then the Australians came back and took Malaya. They had a couple of shore bombardments with battleships that took off a couple of the Japanese infantry. So Malaya is now back in the Far East Command's control. And then the Australians actually upgraded their factory from a minor to a major because with bonuses, they're getting $28 a turn. So more money than what a minor factory could produce. So they went ahead and upgraded that factory. So Australia is actually going to be quite a bit of a factor here in the Pacific. So I think it's still too close to call. Obviously, on the Pacific side of the map, Japan is definitely feeling the crunch and not sure they're going to be able to hold on much longer with the Australians and the Americans having complete control of the Pacific, being able to land anywhere they want in Asia, really. But then it's kind of the opposite on the European side. Italy is even starting to be a little bit resurgent here. So see how things play out after the next turn. So 14 turns are complete, and I think we are going to call the game. And we have our first Allied victory, first in these of 3 games played so far. And even then, I'm not completely sure of an Allied victory. If you guys want to leave some comments, whether you think the Allies have officially won the game. So the issue is the Europe 1940 portion of the game, okay? The Allies win by controlling Berlin and Rome for a full round of play as long as one of the Allied capitals are in their control. On the Pacific side of the map, they win the game by controlling Tokyo for a round of play as long as an Allied capital is under their control. I looked in both rule books. They do have in each rule book a section of if you combine the games and play the entire conflict, which this game is, and it does specify a few different rules when you combine the 2 games, but I can't find anything in either rule book that deals with if there's a change in victory conditions. So in essence, it looks like either the Axis or the Allies can win the entire conflict by just succeeding in capturing the victory conditions on one side of the map. That doesn't seem right to me. I would assume that the victory conditions would change if you combine the two games into one and do the entire war. But again, I couldn't find that anywhere in the rule book. So we're going to go ahead and declare this an Allied victory, and we'll see why here in a few minutes. On the European side, the Axis are still very much in the fight and even have the upper hand. The Germans actually came up here into Sea Zone 125 and wiped out all those British transports and a couple of destroyers because they built up quite the navy in Western Germany. So the British have these infantry and tanks stranded in Norway. They do have these 3 transports over here. But again, Germany's built up quite an air force. So if the game was to continue, the Allies would have to devote a lot of resources to building up their own air force to counter that, because the Germans can just send those planes out and continue to bomb ships. They've also built up a stack of about 15 or so men in Western Germany. So they've got all of Western Europe is back under Axis control and is pretty well defended. It'd be a couple of turns before the Western Allies landed back in Europe, and obviously that would give Germany a couple turns worth of putting units down. So they're pretty secure for now in Western Europe. The Eastern Front, it's all under German control. The Russians have been completely knocked out of the game. The Germans built 4 Stukas they put in Romania here this last turn, which we're going to come down and support these couple of mechs. So on this next turn, these couple of mechs could have came down, taken Persia, another $2, and activated Iraq. So that would have been altogether $4 up for Germany, plus they would have got 3 free infantry from Iraq. They would have brought these Stukas down, maybe these 3 tanks they put down in Moscow. So Cairo is definitely going to be under threat here in the next couple of turns. The British did respond by building 3 tanks in Cairo, and they also built 3 fighters they put in the Union of South Africa. And that would have probably continued until the Germans actually made the assault on Cairo. But you also had the Italians were a little bit resurgent. Again, the British pulled their fleet out of the Med because they needed the transports to get back to London. So the Italians got the $5 bonus back for not having any Allied surface ships in the Med. So with bonuses, they were up to about $16, which isn't too bad for Italy. They did buy a couple of strategic bombers this last turn because they had saved their money from the turn before that. So they were actually, if the game was to continue, going to send the strategic bombers down here and start bombing this factory in Cairo. And the Italians also have a decent air force right now, a couple of Strat bombers, a couple of tactical bombers, and 4 fighters. So not only is Rome not in any danger of falling anytime soon, but the Italian air force was going to start doing some damage here in North Africa. And altogether with bonuses, Germany is basically even right now. They're like $2 behind the U.S. They're each collecting with bonuses upwards of $80, $82 or so. So on the European side, you know, Germany could have more than held their own for a while. They might even have ejected the British out of Norway, got that bonus back. Again, Italy, a little bit resurgent, would have started launching some offensive operations. The U.S. has 3 transports over on the east coast of the United States, but no units to transport them. They did drop 6 strategic bombers down in the eastern United States. But I think it would have, if the game would have continued, it would have been interesting. Probably because of what happened in the Pacific, the Axis would have started getting squeezed. Germany definitely would have stayed strong for several turns, maybe even taken Cairo out. But the fact that there's no Axis power left really in the Pacific, it would have slowly started to turn against Germany for sure. So in the Pacific, the big battle was here, obviously, in Tokyo. So at first, the U.S. kind of hesitated to attack and then said, and just went for broke and went in. They had about 7 transports worth of men and mechs, couple of battleships, couple of cruisers, shore bombardment. They had all 3 of these carriers had planes on it. And then the big thing was they had, I think, 3 Strat bombers down in the Caroline Islands that came up. And then they had like another 7 Strat bombers that could make it from the western United States. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they would have came back to Iwo Jima. So the Japanese had a decent defense force. They had about 15 men and I think 12 fighters, but the 4 U.S. ships that can conduct shore bombardment all hit. So that took off 4 infantry right away. So as you can see, it wasn't that close. There's 1 mech left that took Tokyo, and they still had 5 Strat bombers. So obviously to take Tokyo with a ground unit, they would have continued to sacrifice the Strat bombers if the combat would have lasted any longer. But Tokyo fell. And again, the rules for victory in the Pacific is for the Allies, Tokyo, Allied occupied, and an Allied capital free of Axis control. And actually all Allied capitals on this side are free of Axis control. As a matter of fact, the Japanese are holding on to just 2 victory cities right now, Hong Kong and Shanghai, and both of those would have fell on this next turn. Now, the game isn't officially over, even if I'm interpreting the rules correctly. Tokyo would have to be held for this entire next round. But as you can see, Japan has nothing that can take Tokyo back. The only units they have left on the board are down here in China. They do have a couple of Strat bombers and a couple of tactical bombers, but no transports, no way to get any ground units into Tokyo. So this next round of play wouldn't have changed anything. The Far East Command ventured out, took Burma, and obviously with the Japanese not having any money, not being able to produce anything, these Japanese units would have probably just retreated into the interior of China, maybe tried to team up with some German units coming from Moscow to make a defense along the Russian-Chinese border here. But other than that, Japan wasn't going to be able to do anything else. Anzac came over. They got their fleet off of Malaya here, so I could see in the next couple of turns the Australians moving through the Indian Ocean, going into the Suez to back up the British in the Mediterranean. Again, the Far East Command would have started taking back all these territories in South China. They would have started taking the Chinese territories back, and that would have reactivated the Chinese, so they would have been back into it. The U.S., not only did they collect their $80-something, but they got the Japanese money, which was like another 60-something. The Australians put down transports and men, so then those guys would have been able to start moving around on the next turn. So absolutely no way Japan could have come back. So it would have just been a matter of time with all of these allied nations here in the Pacific devoting the resources to Germany and Italy. I still think that it would have just been maybe a few turns down the road, and it might have been a complete Allied victory. So that's how things shape up. It took 14 turns, the longest game, and again, the Allies finally got a win. I think that the Allies definitely engaged in quite a bit of strategic bombing this turn. So over the course of the game, I would say the Germans mostly suffered from strategic bombing, so they probably had to devote, I would say, a good $100 or more in income just to repair the damage to factories. So I think that was a big part of the Allied victory, although Germany is still strong and it's Japan that faltered. I think with the Japanese, they didn't concentrate, other than taking out China, they didn't concentrate on any one of the Allied powers in the Pacific. They should have probably went and tried to take out the Far East Command. If you leave all of the major Allied powers in the Pacific still in the game, the balance starts to tilt against Japan after a few turns, just militarily and economically. So, and I think that's what happened. And then the U.S. spent the majority of their money in the Pacific, a Japan first kind of strategy for the United States. And obviously that worked. So again, if you guys know any difference in the rules of the victory conditions when you combine the two games, please let me know in a comment. I'd definitely like to know if this is official Allied victory. Other than that, we'll be back with another game. Not sure it's going to be X and Allies Global 40. We might switch it up a little bit, but we'll see you guys soon.